name, which is Mina. I would like to express my gratitude to our esteemed speaker for graciously accepting our invitation today. Our presenter come all the way from Kenya, and before this, he and a group of students had come to visit Inspem. Before we proceed, allow me to provide a brief introduction of our presenter, Dr. Titus Orwa. Dr. Titus Okelo Orwa is currently a lecturer at the Institute of Mathematical Sciences in Strathmore University, Kenya. He has a background in applied mathematics. He has a general research interest in mathematical modeling and specific interest in infectious disease model. And without further delay, I would like to invite Dr. Titus to give a talk. Please welcome.
Thank you, Mohammed, for such a good introduction. So I want to assume you can all hear my voice.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, and I want to also thank you for giving me the opportunity to make this presentation. I think this is because of the encounter we had sometimes back. I and my team were able to visit your university, and that was my third time coming into Malaysia. So in the past, I think I'd visited some part of Malaysia. I think this was just forgetting the name. Penang. We had gone to Penang Island, I think twice, and I think through that I was able to get a connection to your university, and I'm quite happy to be here to give this talk. So, from the introduction, my background is mathematics, but I'm biased towards applied maths with specific interest in infectious disease modeling. Yeah, so what I'm going to present here is part of a study that I did, of course, with the support of one of my colleagues who is not here. And the study is mathematical modeling with specific focus on in-host malaria dynamics. And this model is extended in the latter part of the presentation to include intervention, which in this case would be malaria vaccine. So this is a theoretical study, and I'll rely on existing theories, especially within the realm of mathematical biology, to be able to explain some of the results and some of the presentations. As you've been told, my university is Strathmore University, and I teach mathematics. So just a short list of what I'm going to go through. So let me just begin by giving us a short presentation on why malaria. Yeah, so I come from Kenya, and in Kenya we have quite a number of malaria cases. Yeah, so we can maybe begin by looking at the global situation. Yeah, so malaria is actually a mosquito-borne. It's an infectious disease, and it's caused by this parasite called Plasmodium, parasite of the genus Plasmodium. So within this, we have a number of species. We have Plasmodium falciparum, Plasmodium ovale, Plasmodium vivax, Plasmodium knowlesi, Plasmodium malariae. And these parasites cause malaria in different parts of the world. In the region where I am currently in, this is part of the larger sub-Saharan African region. Malaria is largely caused by Plasmodium falciparum, and therefore in this presentation, the focus is on Plasmodium falciparum and its dynamics. Yeah, so because of malaria and malaria cases, it's usually a serious burden, both economic and at personal level, to individuals and to governments in these malaria endemic countries. Looking at the recent statistics in 2021, these are statistics of 2021, but presented in 2022 by the World Health Organization. If you look at the numbers, about 247 million cases were reported within that period, with over 500,000 deaths globally due to malaria. This has not changed much because if you compare with the previous years, the percentage of these infections reported in the African region has been quite high, and even in the recent statistics, it's still 95%. So 95% of all these cases are actually within the WHO African region, which is also pretty poor, and that is still a serious challenge. And that means existing intervention measures, there's still a lot that needs to be done to cut or to reduce this number of cases and even deaths. And what you also need to know is that most of these deaths, close to 500,000, are actually from children under the age of 5. Yeah, so the existing controls or treatments or intervention measures some still face a lot of challenges. For example, we still have challenges with parasite resistance to existing antimalarial drugs. We also have resistance to vector control measures by the vectors, in this case, the mosquito. And that means the other option would be to try and find a vaccine for malaria. And there's been a lot of effort. I mean, for many, many years, there's been a lot of effort from different companies to try and get a vaccine for malaria. And the biggest challenge is the efficacy. Yeah, so we have some vaccines that have shown some promise, but the efficacies are still quite low. And I think the most advanced is the RTSS, which is about 55% efficacious, but for a very short period, 12 months. Yeah, so in 2021, WHO recommended the use of RTSS in some countries, and in 2022, there's a pre-qualification notice, but this was just in Kenya, I think Ghana, and Malawi, and this was specific with a target on Plasmodium falciparum. So if you look at the global map, you notice that the malaria endemic countries are still largely around this. You can actually see these colors. So the darker the color, the higher the number of malaria cases or burden in that part. And you can actually see this is the map of Africa. And this particular region here is what you're calling the sub-Saharan African region. So still quite a number of cases in most of these countries, and even the deaths. Malaysia is somewhere here. Malaysia has not had, I think for the last 3 years, it had not had any case of indigenous malaria. Yeah, so you guys seated over there pretty safe from this, but still a lot of caution or prevention measures in some of these places. It's yet to be declared by WHO as a malaria-free area, but there's some good progress from the other end. Yeah, so usually following a rapid diagnostics test, malaria-infected individuals can always be given ACT. This is artemisinin-based combination therapies to get treatment from malaria parasites. Yeah, but one of the challenges of these ACTs, as has been the case in the past, is the threat of resistance. And unfortunately, some of these threats have been detected in Eritrea, Rwanda, Uganda, and the greater Mekong region. Again, most of these countries are within this dark part of the world where we still have more endemic malaria cases. Now, if you look at the last 2 or 3 years, you notice that malaria cases, one of the explanations for the increase in the number of cases has been COVID-19. or COVID-19 pandemic, which disrupted nearly everything. And that may have also affected services that are meant to target malaria prevention measures. But there are also other factors that could explain why we still have these high numbers, including humanitarian crises, natural disasters, funding challenges, and even the rising costs of commodities, including malaria nets, high indoor residual spraying, chemicals, etc. So all this could explain why we still have the high number of malaria cases and deaths. So that therefore means for scientists and for governments, still a lot of effort need to be put in place to improve existing malaria therapeutic strategies. And one of them is through this kind of studies. These theoretical studies usually generate very interesting insights, which could be explored further through practical research, and that could, in many ways, contribute to reducing malaria cases. So therefore, in this presentation, I'll focus on Plasmodium falciparum malaria. And in my presentation, I'm going to formulate a model. But before I do that, let me just give you the general dynamic, because we need to translate this biological process into a mathematical model. So generally, the malaria has what we call the cycles. So the parasite lives both in the human host and also within the mosquito vector. So I have one circle here. So this first circle here is what happens within the mosquito vector. And then you have two other circles here. There's one at the top, and then there's one at the bottom here. So these two circles happen within the human. So maybe I can start with the human. Yeah, so if you're bitten by a mosquito that has a malaria parasite, at this stage, that malaria parasite is called a sporozoite. So the sporozoite, of course, if injected into your skin, would mold to the liver cells. So this is usually a very safe place for the parasites. And there's a very interesting biological processes within this stage here, how the parasite is able to escape or to evade the immune system so that it's able to hide in the liver. For sometimes nearly in 2 weeks' time. Yeah, usually this cycle takes about 2 weeks, a maximum of 2 weeks, maybe 10 to 14 days. Yeah, so this cycle is what we call the erythrocytic cycle. In some quarters, it's called the pre-erythrocytic stage. Yeah, so the malaria parasites called sporozoites would get to the liver and invade the liver cells, what we call the hepatocytes. Yeah, so these hepatocytes would mature. The infected hepatocytes would progress to schizon stage, and these schizons later would burst open or would rupture. And what comes out is now not the sporozoite that we started with, but what we call the merozoites. Still, the malaria parasite, but in a different form. Yeah, so these merozoites, as soon as the rupture occurs, they are released into the blood. And usually, in the context of malaria symptoms, that is when you begin to have the fever, the headache, and some aspect of tiredness, which are actually some of the symptoms of malaria. And upon release of these merozoites into the bloodstream, their first target would be the red blood cells, or what we call the erythrocytes. Yeah, so the erythrocytes, the merozoites would attack or invade the erythrocytes, and while inside the erythrocytes, they will undergo asexual reproduction, so they'll subdivide, and their population would increase, just like what would happen here at the liver stage. So once the sporozoites enter the hepatocytes, the liver cells, they'll undergo asexual reproduction. So one would generate 2, 3, 4, and that number would grow so that after some times, the cells will rupture because of the high density of the parasites. And at this stage, when it ruptures, because what comes out are the merozoids would attack the red blood cells. And again, something strange happens at this stage. Some of these infected red blood cells, you can also call them erythrocytes, would mature to form what we call the blood schizones. And these blood schizones, again, could rupture to produce more merozoids into the blood. So that explains how the parasite density or concentration would be increasing. So as more parasites, more merozoids in this case, get released into the blood, you have increased parasitemia, and that causes anemia. And this could easily result into death if no intervention is carried out. So within this stage, again, some of these blood stage, some of these infected red blood cells, instead of generating the merozoids, they actually produce what we call gametocytes. And this is just to explain why the malaria parasite has been able to survive for many years. Yeah. So what would happen is that part of this will develop into gametocytes. So instead of generating the merozoids, part of them would develop into gametocytes. And these gametocytes are what is later picked by mosquitoes. So in this case, we are assuming the mosquitoes are coming to bite an already infectious malaria patient. So this bite at this stage would result into mosquitoes picking these gametocytes. So within the blood of this infected person, we have the infected red blood cells, you have susceptible or healthy red blood cells, and you also have gametocytes. Yeah, and it is these gametocytes that undergo sexual reproduction within the mosquito vector to form okinetes, which later progress to form oocysts. Now, these oocysts, when they rupture, we have the primary vector, the sporozoids. And then these sporozoids within the mosquito gut, upon the bite on any susceptible human beings, these sporozoids will be released into the human dummies, and this other circle starts again. Yeah, so you have these two circles, which, and I think you can actually see that this is the most, this process is very critical. So my team has been trying to explore this. I mean, how do you stop this? And maybe part of my presentation today would be one of the effort to try and stop this, the flow or the formation of this gametocyte. So if there's a way you could actually stop either the production or the number of these gametocytes, then there's a chance that every infected human would not be able to have these parasites, would not have a transmission to the vector. So that if the vector were to take some blood meal, then that blood would either have maybe just the healthy red blood cells, but it will not have the gametocytes, because it is these gametocytes that are actually enabling this cycle to continue. Yeah, so once you have an understanding of this cycle, then we can always formulate a model, which is just a translation of the dynamics here. And then thereafter, we can identify targets of intervention, which I'm going to explain. So if you look at the existing malaria model, and in this case, I'm focusing on in-host malaria models. So these are models that target or try to explain the dynamics within the human host. Yeah, so of course we understand the malaria. If you look at this map, so you have the mosquito vector, and you have the vertebrate. So the vertebrate here, in this case, I'm using the human being, but you could also put a cow here or any other animal that can actually harbor these malaria parasites. Yeah, so the earliest model is this simple model here that was formulated in 1989 by Anderson and the colleagues. So this was a very simple model, and this model was just limited to the blood stage. So if I go back to this diagram, you can think of this as the liver stage, this cycle here, and this you can think of as the blood stage. You can also call it the erythrocytic cycle. And then there's this last one, the sporogenic cycle. So in my presentation, and like what has been done in the past, different researchers have focused on different cycles here. So if you look at the model by Anderson, you have three compartments here. So this is a deterministic model. The X here denotes the population or the concentration of healthy red blood cells. The Y here denotes the concentration of infected red blood cells, and M here, the malaria parasite, which in this case are the merozoites. Yeah, so the malaria parasite is baptized with different names at different stages. Yeah, so within the blood stage, that is this cycle here, you only have the merozoites. Yeah, so the invasion of the red blood cells here is purely due to the presence of malaria merozoites. Yeah, so this model, this was a very simple model which ignored the contribution of the immune system in this infection dynamics. Yeah, which was a serious gap because usually the immune system for any organism, whenever there's an invasion, will always try to intervene. So we tried to capture that in our model, as I'll be able to explain. So this model has been extended by other researchers to try and explain the dynamics within the human host. And one notable extension is this one in 2008 by Chiaka. Yeah, so what Chiaka did, he still focused, he and his team still focused the analysis within the blood stage. You can actually see the first compartment, this is the dynamics, the rate at which, or rather the dynamics within of the susceptible red blood cells denoted by X. The Y here are the infected red blood cells. The M here, the merozoites. But then he added these two, the contribution of the immune system. So you had the antibodies, A, and then the immune cells, B. Yeah, so he tried to address the absence of the immune system, which was not included in this model. And one of the results of this model by Chiaka is that they discovered that, of course, through analysis, that the malaria drugs that target or inhibit parasite production. So when I talk about parasite production here, I'm talking about this stage here, where the parasites, this point where there's a rupture. So if this can be reduced by the malaria parasite, according to their study, they found that that was seen to be more effective than on inhibiting merozoite invasion. Yeah, the invasion of the merozoite is what happens here. So this is the red blood cells get invaded by this merozoite. So instead of targeting this, you could actually target these merozoites before they actually burst, or before they burst and release more parasites into the human blood. Yeah, so out of this, we extended this model here and included additional compartments with the target of the intervention, which in this case are the malaria vaccines. Yeah, so the model I'm going to present does not include the antimalarial drug, but we also did that as well. Maybe in one of the presentations, I can always present the model with the malaria, with the use of malaria drug as an intervention. And I also have another model which combines both the vaccines and the anti-malarial drugs. Yeah, so this is the model. So this model, so the extension from what has been done in the past is to include this liver stage. So this is the first extension in our case. So the blood stage, this has been explored in many models, but we opted to include the liver stage. So within the liver stage, you have, as I'd explained earlier in this slide here, of what happens. This is the liver stage, and then this is the blood stage. So you can always translate that and put an image. So this is a diagram. I call it a flow diagram. You can also call it a schematic flow diagram, which is just a simple representation of the dynamics on the other side. And then from here, we can generate the mathematical equations which constitute the model. Yeah, so you have the malaria parasite, we call them the sporozoids. So these sporozoids would invade the hepatocytes. I'm using letter S. So this is a compartment, and the population here is that of the sporozoids. So we are assuming that upon a bite, you have a deposit of lambda sporozoids, and these sporozoids invade. So the dotted lines here denote an interaction. So using what I call the law of mass action, this interaction, which in this case is invasion, would result into infected hepatocytes. So when these hepatocytes get infected, we have this HX, which denote the infected hepatocytes. And this infection happens, or this invasion happens at the rate beta S. Yeah, so if you write beta S SH, then this denotes the invasion, and this invasion results into the formation of these infected hepatocytes, which are actually infected liver cells. So within these cells, you have the parasites. Then these cells, as we had seen in that cycle, after some time, will form the liver schizons that burst to produce the merozoids. And there's really no direct arrow from here to here. So there should be some gap here so that we just have an arrow pointing into M. And this term here, this is just the concentration or the population of merozoids that are coming out of this compartment. The letter N here denotes the number of merozoids per bursting liver schizons. So that you have this M here now denotes the population or the concentration of the malaria merozoids. So just like in all these other compartments, we allow natural death, for example, of the sporozoids at the rate delta S. So as the sporozoids molt from your skin, from the point of bite, all the way to the liver cells, there's a chance some of them will die naturally. And in the absence of intervention, and the intervention here could be the vaccines or the malaria drug, some of these may die naturally at the rate delta S. The same thing would happen to the liver hepatocytes, just like they're generated at the rate lambda H from the bone marrow. They can also die naturally at the rate μ1. And then I have this term here, phi1. Usually, whenever there is an invasion, or whenever there's a pathogen comes into, whenever a pathogen comes into the human body, there's always that tendency of the immune system to intervene. And in this case, the letter Z here denotes one of the immune cells. So they're usually quite a number. We could use the macrophages, or we could use the CD40 cells or the CD8 cells. These ones have the capacity to eliminate through phagocytosis the infected liver schizons or the infected red blood cells, either at the trophozoid stage or at the schizoid stages. Yeah, so one of the extension was to include this liver stage. So these merozoites at the blood stage would actually invade the red blood cells. And as a result, you form the infected red blood cells, which is denoted by this compartment. And then we have the immune system here, which is expected to intervene by removing the merozoites directly or removing the infected red blood cells. So this is a very simple model from the dynamics that is captured here. There's still a lot more that somebody could explore. So now from this model, from this schematic flow diagram, we generate the differential equations, which in this case is a compartmental model with how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there are 7 compartments here and therefore 7 differential equations. And this is actually the model that describes the dynamics within the liver and blood stages. And there are a number of assumptions. So maybe in the second model where I have the interventions, I have listed some assumptions that one could actually consider. But even in this, there are a lot of assumptions. Yeah, so I may not list them here. Yeah, but this is the model that one would generate from that dynamic. So for example, the immune cell, there are several of these cells, but in this case, I'm assuming I'm only picking one which maybe for purposes of modeling the CD8 T cells or the macrophages would be important in these dynamics. So usually once this model is formed, then we can bring in the interventions. And in this presentation, the interventions are only in form of vaccines. Yeah, so if you scroll back to this, then we could have vaccines that target the merozoids at the liver stage. The sporozoids at the liver stage. So if we can actually eliminate, for example, the sporozoids, or ensure that this cycle does not take place, then there's a chance we may not even need medication for malaria if it is possible to mitigate this erythrocytic cycle through a vaccine. So usually the vaccine at this stage is what we are calling the pre-erythrocytic vaccine. There are quite a number that have been explored. And as I indicated earlier, RTSS is the most advanced malaria vaccine at this particular stage, which targets the invasion. It targets the sporozoids before and after the invasion of the liver cells. The other malaria vaccine, which is called the blood stage vaccine, which targets this cycle. So again, this would be important either in reducing the invasion of the susceptible red blood cells, or maybe reducing the rate at which, or the number of the secondary merozoids produced per bursting infected red blood cells. And then the third vaccine could target these gametocytes. Yeah, so from the human host, if it's possible, that we could reduce, if not to eliminate, the concentration of gametocytes, so that for every pint of blood that the mosquito picks from the human host, there are very few or very minimal concentration of gametocytes. Then the secondary effect is that this number of sporozoids that would be injected into the human host would be lower. Yeah, so in my modeling, I also tried to target these three so that the model has, in terms of intervention, 3 kinds of vaccines. Yeah, so I have a pre-erythrocytic vaccine, which targets the parasite at the liver stage, the blood stage vaccine, which would target the parasites within the blood stage, and the transmission blocking vaccine, which, although this is given to the human host, the effect is supposed to be in the mosquito vector and not in the human host. So usually this is one of the challenges of this vaccine. For the companies and the scientists that are developing this, usually the challenge is, how do you give a vaccine to a human being, yet the person knows the vaccine will be of no benefit to him or her? Yeah, so usually there is very minimal progress with this vaccine, but there's a lot of progress with the pre-erythrocytic vaccines. Yeah, so I have additional assumptions here. So one is, like I have indicated, there are 3 vaccines that I'm going to introduce into this model. The PEV, which denotes the pre-erythrocytic vaccine, targeting the parasites at the liver stage. So what you'd expect that this vaccine will weaken or delimitate the sporozoites. And then secondly, so that effect will be seen in reducing this term here. Let me just go back. This term here. So we'd expect this recruitment term to be less because of the pre-erythrocyte, because of not pre-erythrocytic, but this will be less because of transmission blocking vaccine. But the pre-erythrocytic vaccine will reduce this invasion term or invasion rate beta S. That is one assumption. And in all these situations, I'm going to assume the efficacy of the vaccines would range between 0 and 1. So if it's 1, of course, we will not allow it to get to 1. The writing of the inequality here is very deliberate. So maybe I would have added 1 here so that it's possible for V to be 0, so that there's no intervention. But V should not be 1, otherwise you'll have a problem. Yeah, so the vaccine efficacies in the context of this modeling will lie between 0 and 1, both excluded, 1 being excluded. And there are 3 types of vaccines: the pre-erythrocytic vaccine, the blood stage vaccine, and the transmission blocking vaccine. So the blood stage vaccine, of course, this is expected to play a role at the blood stage. And one would be to reduce the invasion parameter beta R by this term 1 minus E, where E is the efficacy of that vaccine. And I also have one more assumption here, that with the introduction of blood stage vaccine, one of the secondary effects of that is that the density of the merozoites that would be released per bursting blood schizont would be lower. Yeah, so then there's one more here. So just like in the case of the blood stage, at the liver stage, because of the pre-erythrocytic vaccine, the density of the merozoites that would be produced per bursting liver schizont would also be lower. And finally, I'm assuming in this case that, just like we had indicated earlier and just like the previous model, the immune system, in this case, we are only considering the CD8 T cells. Because of the presence of these vaccines that you're going to introduce into the model, the production of these immune cells are likely to go up or to increase. And that the rate to denote that increase would be tau. And we are restricting tau for purposes of simulation, which you're going to do later, to lie between 1 and 2. Yeah, and then the transmission blocking vaccines, the TBV, in this case, are expected to reduce the sporozoite recruitment term lambda. Yeah, so this is, sometimes this can be ambiguous, but I think just because we wanted to capture the possible impact of these three vaccines, we argued that by giving this vaccine to the human host, the gametocytes density would be lower, and that means the mosquito vector will either have lower density of these gametocytes or even none, and the secondary effect would be that for the subsequent bites on any human being or any other vertebrate, then the density of the sporozoids will be either very low or non-existent. Again, in this case, we using the parameter chi to denote the efficacy of the transmission blocking vaccine. Chi would lie between 0 and 1. The other assumption is that because of these infected cells, the infected hepatocytes, the infected trophozoites, and the infected schizones, the production, so the presence of these infected cells may stimulate the production of the immune cells, in this case CD8 T cells. And using and we can actually represent that acceleration by these equations, which is just formulated from the Michaelis-Menten monod function. So if you have an idea of the Michaelis-Menten monod function, then this is just to capture the fact that while the stimulation is expected to increase the concentration of CD8 T cells, this stimulation will also depend on the concentration of these infected cells. And there's a point beyond which what I would call the saturation point, where you don't expect the CD8 T cells to increase. And in this case, the delta X here represent the immunogenicity. So usually if there are pathogens that are expected to elicit an immune response, then the rate at which they're able to do that is what we are calling or terming as immunogenicity of those infected cells. And then we also assume in this model that this is not even an assumption, because we expect the CD8 T cells to phagocyte or to eat these infected cells. That is the infected liver cells and the infected red blood cells. So for purposes of notation, you must have noted that I'm using letter X here to denote the infected hepatocytes. And I think in the earlier model, I'd used HX. Yeah, so there's really no much difference. It's just I didn't want to use H again because I wanted H to represent the hepatocytes, and then X, we can use that to denote the infected hepatocytes. Yeah, so from that assumption, then the model I showed you earlier, this is the schematic flow. And then in this case, I have added, if you compare this with what we had before, we still have the sporozoids, the hepatocytes, and the infected hepatocytes. So this top part denotes the liver stage, and this part here denotes the blood stage. So you have the merozoids infecting the red blood cells to form the infected red blood cells, which have split into two. So this denotes the trophozoids, the infected red blood cells, but at early stages. And then the blood schizones here denote the mature. So these ones are at a stage where they can burst open to produce more merozoids, so that this blood stage cycle continues. But then I have these two. We have the gametocytes. So when the merozoids infect the red blood cells, we can either get more merozoids or we could have the gametocytes. And I just added this because I needed to add the transmission blocking vaccine, which is added, whose effects is indicated at the farthest end here. But in terms of modeling using this kind of models, this would be termed as a redundant compartment because there is no interaction. And sometimes you can actually exclude this from your model, especially given that there is no circulation beyond this point, because in this model, we have not included the mosquito vector. So maybe if you were to add the mosquito vector, then we could have had other compartments beyond this, which is an opportunity for extension of this particular model. And the last compartment here is this. The W here denotes the CD8 T cells. So this plays a very big role here. So sometimes there will be stimulation, as I've indicated. So you can actually see this term here, and this term. So all these arrows coming into W, they just to signify that the production or the concentration of the CD8 T cells would go up whenever the presence of these infected liver cells, infected red blood cells, T and C. And then we assume that the CD8 T cells are generated at the rate lambda omega from the thymus, and they can also die naturally at the rate mu W. Yeah, so the vaccines, you can see there's a term here for the transmission blocking vaccine to reduce that recruitment term. And you also have one here for the blood stage vaccine, for the pre-erythrocytic vaccine to reduce this invasion rate, beta S. And then we also have one here for the blood stage vaccine to reduce the invasion of the red blood cells rate, beta R. The same is also here. So usually, because of the presence of the immune cells, because of the phagocytotic property which I had explained earlier, these infected cells would actually be eliminated. So other than the natural death at the rate mu T and mu C for the blood schizons, they can also be eliminated through phagocytosis by these immune cells, the CD8 T cells. And that elimination will also depend on the concentration of these cells in the blood. And that is captured by the terms down here. Yeah, so that therefore gives us this system, which has how many compartments? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So 9 compartmental deterministic model. So usually once you have the model, you can perform model analysis. We can check whether that model is both biologically and mathematically feasible. And in this case, we can always check, for example, the steady states. I didn't include that in my assumption, but usually we assume that all these parameters are negative. So there are a number of parameters I've used here, probably close to 20. So we assume they are all negative. And then secondly, we also assume that the variables S, H, X, denoting the different populations under our consideration here, are also negative. So we cannot have negative number of sporozoites. So you can always do a quick check on that by just trying to solve these differential equations one by one and checking that at any future time t, each of these state variables will remain positive. We can also always check if the solutions are bounded, in which case here I could categorize the different compartments. So for example, all the malaria parasites, the sporozoites and the merozoites, you could combine those two equations and check and solve that system and check if at any future time that population will be bounded. Bounded in the sense that if it were to grow, maybe it can only grow up to a certain value. and the minimum would actually be 0. So those analyses are not added here, but those are quick analyses you can always check for any disease model that you formulate. And then thereafter, you can check also the existence of equilibrium points. So for most infectious diseases, we can always check if there's a disease-free equilibrium point, a state in which there are no pathogens and therefore the individuals are free of infection. Yeah, so if in this system, you take, for example, the first equation and equate to 0 all these pathogens and infected compartments, then you'll be able to find the population of that compartment in the absence of infection. In this case, if there are no infections, then we don't expect the malaria parasites to exist. So the S, which denotes the sporozoids, the M, which denotes the merozoids, will be 0, 0. Similarly, the gametocytes would not exist, so this will also be 0. So that means the only, similarly, the infected liver cells, the infected red blood cells, both the trophozoites and the schizons will also be 0. So the only populations that will have values at disease-free state are the susceptible or the healthy liver cells, this, which corresponds to H, the red blood cells, R, and also the CD8 T cells, which will always exist. So that would be your disease-free equilibrium point. You can always check the stability of this equilibrium point, whether it is locally stable or globally stable, using existing theorems in epidemic modeling. I have not done that here. And I have it in a write-up, but it's not part of this presentation. Yeah, so usually for a disease model, we also check what is called a reproduction number, a very popular quantity. So in terms of definition for any disease, a reproduction number, and I'm talking about infectious diseases that can spread from one person to another or from one animal to another. The reproduction number represents the average number of secondary infections that a single infectious case would generate in a completely susceptible population. So for example, if I have flu or if I have malaria infection, then there's a chance a mosquito could bite me, and this mosquito could bite one other person, and this other person would also be bitten. And so at the end of the day, the number of secondary infections that one case can generate or define the reproduction number. So usually when there's an intervention, we can always relabel that and call it effective reproduction number, which in this case, I'm calling the vaccination reproduction number. So usually this is a very important quantity in infectious disease modeling because it represents on average how many secondary infections are expected per infective case. So in our case, the infective pathogens that we're going to consider here are not just the parasites, but the infected cells, because it is these infected cells that burst open to produce merozoids, which then infect other cells. So if you compute this, so there's a formula of computing this. Usually, in this case, I used what we call the next generation matrix method. Yeah, so usually you just pick the compartment that are either infected or infectious and leave out all the susceptible compartments from the model. So there are a bit 4 steps that one need to carry out before you can get the reproduction number, which is the spectral radius of the next generation matrix, which I've not displayed here. Usually the spectral radius is just the largest eigenvalue of the next generation matrix. So usually once you get this quantity, of course, with information or knowledge of the parameter values, you can always get a number here. So for different values of P, pi, A, beta R, gamma, etc., we can either get a number 1 or 2 or 3 or 0.7. So generally, all infectious diseases, if you check the WHO website, you'll find that for all those infectious diseases, there's always an R naught, which represent the number of secondary cases. So this usually informs the kind of intervention or the speed and the measures that need to be taken. So if R naught is higher, then you'd expect the infection to spread very fast within a community. And when it is lower, then there's a chance that it could even die out, sometimes even without intervention. Yeah, so we can always check the stability of the equilibrium point. So the disease-free, we can check whether it is locally stable. We can also check whether it's globally stable using theorems that are within the realm of epidemic modeling. So then you must have also noted that there are quite a number of parameters here. And usually in any model, you may want to find out how sensitive the dynamics are with respect to individual parameters. So that means you need to compute the sensitivity indices. In this case, because the R naught is an indication, or the RV is an indication of how fast the infection is spreading, we can always find out how these different parameters drive the RV. So that parameters that would drive RV would actually form part of the target for intervention. Yeah, so for example, using the normalized forward sensitivity computation technique, we're able to generate these sensitivity indices for the different parameters that are in this RV expression, the vaccine or the vaccination reproduction number. And from this list, you can actually notice that some of these are positive, while others are negative. So the positive ones are expected to increase the value of RV when they increased, while the negative ones are expected to reduce the value of RV when they increased. Then secondly, you can look at this magnitude. The sensitivity indices usually lie between 0 and 1, plus or minus. And the closer it is to 1, that identifies a very significant parameter. And if it's closer to 0, then those parameters are less significant. And again, usually you still have to give the interpretation based on the model at hand. So in this case, P is very significant in relation to changes in RV. So P, as per our definition, is the expected number of merozoites. On average, the number of merozoites released per bursting blood schizont. This is at the blood stage. So when the infected red blood cells burst, there are a certain number of malaria parasites that they'll be able to release into the blood. And that is what we are denoting by P. And in this sensitivity analysis results, that is seen to be significant with a value of +1. Another significant parameter is this one here, which is the efficacy of the blood stage vaccine, -0.77. The others are very low values. Yeah, so even from here, we can actually pick something very relevant, which means, and this explains why we have the antimalarial drugs, which usually target the parasites. Yeah, so within the blood stage, the antimalarial drugs will kill the merozoites, but at the same time, the immune cells will phagocyte on these blood schizons. Yeah, so if there's a chance to stimulate the production of the CD8 T cells with the help of the vaccines, then most of this burst size with LRB, the burst size would be very small for the infected red blood cells. Then, just to display the numerical results, so we investigated the effect of the 3 vaccines, the pre-erythrocytic vaccine, the blood cell vaccine, and the transmission blocking vaccine on the different populations in the model. So in this case, we were varying the efficacy of the blood stage vaccine E from 10% to 90%, or between 0 and 1. Of course, 1 is not included. But what we noticed is that if the efficacy is close to 9.9, that's about 90% efficacy of the vaccine, then we are guaranteed, there's a guarantee that we'll be able to eliminate all these blood schizons. So these are infected red blood cells, and they're infected with the parasites. Yeah, and we did this for all the compartments, but for this presentation, I was able to have, I think, 6 graphs. So these are the first pair, and we're actually able to show that the efficacy of the vaccine is very important, not just a vaccine. And even at 50% efficacy, you still have a lot of these infected blood schizons within the human, within the infected human. But if the efficacy, we try to vary this, any value close to 90%, we were guaranteed of eliminating these blood schizons. So eliminating the blood schizons here could involve the stimulation of CD8 T cells to phagocyte on them, or the reduced invasion of the susceptible red blood cells. Yeah, and you can actually see the same with the gametocytes. So if the efficacy of the blood stage vaccine is higher, it's also evident that there'll be very few gametocytes. And actually, you may not even have gametocytes after a certain number of days. Yeah, so I think around here, by day 5 or day 4, you may not have any gametocytes in blood. But if the efficacy is lower, you can actually see even up to 70%, you still have some samples of these gametocytes in blood. Yeah, so from here, actually, what we concluded is that a better malaria vaccine, this is replicated for the other vaccines as well, especially if you are to have a blood stage vaccine, then the target, the most effective one, or the efficacy should target close to 90%, which matches what the vaccine of other infectious diseases. So if you think of diseases that have whose vaccines have been successful, or diseases that have been successfully contained by vaccine, usually the efficacies are quite high. Yeah, so in this case, 90%. But again, as we'll see in the conclusion, this should be treated with caution, because all these simulations are actually from parameters that we obtain from literature, some of which we assumed, and we also have a deterministic model. So sensible result, insightful, but you should also treat it with caution. Yeah, so again here, I also checked the impact of the blood stage vaccine, which is expected to boost the production of CD8 T cells on the infected blood cells. So usually in the context of intervention for the human beings, what would make one die from malaria infection is the loss of the red blood cells. And that is why in my display, a bit biased, we focus on the trophozoites and the schizons. Yeah, so again here you can notice, because we restricted tau to lie between 1 and 2, the higher the value of tau, that is the increased production of CD8 T cells due to the presence of vaccines, then you notice that the density of the infected red blood cells, both for the trophozoites and the blood schizons, are actually lower. So when tau is 2, you can see you have the lowest graph down here. And when tau is 1, it's slightly up there. And then we also checked what would be the impact if you were to theoretically combine the vaccines. So you can think of combining a blood stage vaccine and maybe a transmission blocking vaccine, or combining a transmission blocking vaccine and pre-erythrocytic vaccine, or combining all of them. Yeah, so we performed a scenario analysis on that, and we noted that as long as the efficacy of the vaccines were close to 90, any combination would result in a significant decline in the population or in the density of the infected red blood cells. Yeah, so here I have around 8 graphs, but I've just displayed 2 here. And in these 2, we fixed the efficacy of the blood stage vaccine and the transmission blocking vaccine at 90%, and varied the efficacy of the pre-erythrocytic vaccine from 10% to 90%, and you have this kind of output here. The same happens on this other side for the blood schizons. Yeah, so in conclusion, the malaria vaccine, for it to be effective, and we only checked one parameter here, that is efficacy. Though we are also aware that for any malaria vaccine to be considered a good intervention, it should be safe, it should be affordable, and it should also be efficacious. Yeah, so in this case, we only checked on efficacy. So a 90% efficacy of at least 90% would be good enough to offer protection, especially for Plasmodium falciparum. But like I've indicated, you should treat this with caution because of the fact that all the parameters used here are from literature, and also some are estimated. Then from the graph here, we notice that a combination of malaria vaccine could give us a comparably good outcome. Some of these have not been done in the field. For example, this second one here. I'm yet to see a study where the malaria vaccines are combined, but this is a good step. So maybe just like in the case of malaria, anti-malarial drugs, which are currently combined. So initially they were individual, we would call them monotherapies, but today they are combined to form ACTs. So maybe the same could happen with the vaccines. So like what we have now, if you look at the stages of development for the different vaccines, the efficacies are quite low for most of them. Maybe there's a chance, if they could be combined, there's a chance that the result could be better. And in another study, which as indicated earlier, we also explored the effect of combining the vaccines and the anti-malarial drug, and we were able to get far much better therapeutic outcome. Yeah, so finally, maybe just to highlight some limitations of this kind of studies. One is usually the model assumptions. So because this is a deterministic model, it may not capture some of very complex life cycles of the parasite. A good example is the invasion. The point at which the parasites invade the hepatocytes, or when the merozoites invade the erythrocytes, that dynamics is so complex. And sometimes by just using a parameter to represent that particular invasion, you may not capture all that actually happens. You can also think of gametocytogenesis, how the gametes or the gametocytes are formed. It's also another strange step in the life cycle of the malaria parasite, but which is very important in its continued existence. Then I've also said some of these parameter values, most of them are obtained from existing literature. Others are assumed, and that sometimes may compromise or put doubt on the kind of analysis or results that one has. Maybe to improve this kind of models, what some people have done in the past is to introduce what we call the delayed differential equations instead of the ordinary ODEs that I've just displayed. So for example, the time to invasion from the point the mosquito bites the human to the liver, usually there's some delay, and sometimes that can be 2 hours or 3 hours. You can always capture that in your model. The only challenge with delayed differential equations is the complexity in trying to solve them. So one can easily form them, but now in terms of analysis, you may face a lot of challenges. And finally, these results can always be validated if you have data, which means if you're part of a study in which you can actually experiment and maybe use the data points to validate the kind of results that are presented here, then that would really make them more interesting. However, the insights are there, and this is still very relevant within the wider research space. So these are some of the references I have, and thank you. That marks the end of my presentation.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. And now I would like to open the floor for any question you may have. Please feel free to ask to our speaker. We open for Q&A. Dr. Titus, is it this module you can use same as for the dengue or dengue fever or Aedes mosquito? Is it same model?
Yeah, so the model, this is, so dengue is also has the mosquito as a vector. Yeah, so they could have some similarities, but I need to understand the dynamics of the dengue first, how the dynamics I'm referring to this cycle here. Yeah, so this is for malaria. If dengue behaves or has a similar dynamics, then we could formulate a similar model. But if there are variations, then the model can actually be formulated differently. Yeah, but in my past research activities, I'm yet to explore dengue. Yeah, actually, what we are doing now, we are working on a HIV model, but this HIV has interventions which target mental health. How, or rather, the role of mental health in HIV care cascade. So that's what we are currently doing. Yeah.
So, any question from participants? Dr. Ben, is there any question?
Yeah, okay. Dr. Titus.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned about the combination of vaccines may produce a good result, good impact, right? Are there any research that that study the impact of the combination of vaccines? I mean, sometimes vaccine you cannot take all together at the same time, right? It may require a certain time at a certain stage of time. So, are there any research that that study maybe the effect of the combination of that vaccines?
Yeah, so for the malaria parasite, currently there is no vaccine that is currently I would say recommended or that is currently officially declared against malaria parasite, what we have is RTSS, which is at a very advanced stage. But again, the challenge with RTSS is the efficacy, which is still quite low, and that indicated 55% within a year. So that means after 1 year, maybe you'll need a dose, a second dose. And if you look at the write-up on RTSS, you're supposed to take 3 doses. I think the last dose is in the 4th year. But at that time, the efficacy is even much lower. Yeah. So currently there are no combinations of malaria vaccines in an effort to control malaria. But from our theoretical analysis, we discovered that there's a chance that if we could have a combinations of these malaria vaccines, then we could get better therapeutic outcome compared to what is currently under trial. Yeah, so hope that answers your question.
Okay, but that one still involve time, right? Stages of one vaccine to another vaccine, or you consider uh, it is better to have all vaccine at the same times. I mean, measure of time should be included in the analysis as well, right?
Yeah, so that is correct. That's a good observation. So if you are in this case, we have not differentiated that, but I think in the context of modeling, you can always introduce different vaccines at different stages, and probably that could give you a far much better therapeutic outcome. So maybe you could start with erythrocytic vaccine in the first 2 months, first 5 months, and then introduce another vaccine maybe after 1 year, and another vaccine in the 4th year onwards. So that is something that we are yet to explore, but a good suggestion.
Okay. Yeah. But very nice presentation and very detailed analysis. And one last question. Maybe do you have someone from Faculty of Medicine or Health Sciences as a part of your team? Maybe that can validate any part of your analysis.
Thank you. So usually our university is yet to have a medical school, but in 2018, I spent 1 year in Germany,
Oh, okay.
and that really
Hello, Dr. Titus. I think they have a problem. Dr. Titus?
Ada problem internet kot.
Maybe
Dah
they
dah
have.
dah start dah.
Dr. Titus? You still in online? Maybe I think they have problem. Then mungkin kita boleh tutup kan? Kita nak tunggu dia. I think they have problem.
Itulah. Tapi dia masih lagi online ni.
Hello, Dr. Titus. Hello.
Mungkin dia cuba masuk kot.
Wait. Kita tunggu sekejap.
Kita tunggu sekejap lah.
Hello, Dr. Tatus.
Sorry, Mohammed. I think I must have had some interruption with the internet.
Yeah.
Ben, I hope I answered your question. I'm not sure at what time I lost connection.
Okay, no problem. Yes. Thank you
Yeah.
very much,
So
Dr. Titus.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Maybe maybe they don't have a question. And once again, I would like to extend our thanks to our presenter, Dr. Titus, for sharing their knowledge and expert with us today. We truly appreciate your time and effort in delivering your talk today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Titus.
So I also want to extend my gratitude to the whole team at UPM. I hope I'll be able to be part of this group. I mean, next time you can invite me for the next talk. I
Yes,
also want,
yes.
I also want to learn the kind of research, and hopefully this could help us form collaborations, especially with student supervision. If there are students who are working on multidisciplinary projects, then I would be more than willing to be part of the team. So thank you so much. And in Kiswahili, we say asante sana.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Enjoy your
Bye-bye.
evening. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so enjoy.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay, have a nice day.
Nice day too.